let me check.
I think
Yeah,
Damien.
now I can share it. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, good. So why don't we start? Cecilia, do you want to share your slides and I will just introduce you. So
Sure.
it's a great pleasure to have Cecilia Rikap with us here today. Cecilia is a associate professor at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, which is an institute at the at University College London, and she's head of research at the IPP. Cecilia is, prior to the job at UCL, was a senior lecturer at City University in London, and she's also a tenured researcher at CONICET, CONICET, Argentina's National Research Council, and an associate researcher at Costech Lab, Universidad de Tecnología de Campania. So just to introduce Cecilia's talk today, she's talking about a new book that she's working on called The Rulers, Corporate Power in the Age of AI and the Cloud. So thank you very much, Cecilia, for being here. Very much looking forward to this talk. Over to you.
Thanks a lot for this invitation. I'm very happy to be here with all of you. And I will go straight into the main question of the book, which is basically who rules the AI age or the AI and cloud age. And we will see throughout my talk, or at least that's my expectation, that you'll understand why I make all this emphasis on the cloud and not only AI. But before I get into the talk itself, I wanted to first give a sort of methodological footnote, let's say. I wanted to share with you in the book in particular, what I did was work on a quite comprehensive fieldwork that included 112 interviews with people from 55 multinational corporations. And I wanted to give you a snapshot of what that looks like. So I interviewed mainly people working in AI, and this can be either AI research, AI engineering, people doing, let's say, software development, but also including development of AI and the adoption of AI at multiple companies. Of course, big tech companies featured prominently because they are kind of the main subjects of the book, but actually the book is about how all these companies relate to each other as a way to understand how Amazon, Microsoft, and Google are basically controlling the ways in which we are producing knowledge through controlling also how all these other companies are introducing digital technologies that then shape how these other companies themselves are producing and appropriating knowledge. So going now straight to my talk. In the talk, I will also build on some of my empirical research that is already published in different papers. So you will not only see, let's say, snippet from interviews and my analysis from that, but also some other research. Most of that will not be in the book itself. I make references to that in the book because the book is for larger audiences. But I think that for this audience here today, it's relevant to go also into the breadth and depth of the empirical work that I've done for arriving at this analysis. So now, this was the footnote. Now we can start the presentation. And I think that you've all probably seen this type of pictures tons of times by now. And I would describe them as the Western world's ruling coalition. And although the picture features the CEOs slash founders, because, well, now Jeff Bezos, for instance, is no longer the CEO of Amazon and so on, of big tech companies with Donald Trump. This talk is not about the individuals. This talk is about corporate power and how it relates also to political power. So in a way, these guys are representing corporate power and political power, but it's not about their personal relationship. I'm not interested in the intricacies of the personalities of Elon Musk, let's say. I'm interested in how corporate power is built and how it's exercised today and how it is entangled with political power. And in a nutshell, if we want to say, okay, why do I think they are the Western world's ruling coalition? Of course, everybody knows, or at least I hope everybody in this room knows. I said this that when I was talking at the Oxford Internet Institute, and some people looked at me like, "Are you sure?" But these guys are not so critical, let's say. But a lot of people, let's say, knows that big tech companies are controlling the public sphere, and this results in a lack of spaces to have democratic deliberations. But this is not why I call them the ruling coalition. This, to some extent, is the tip of an iceberg, is the surface of why they are ruling global capitalism. And to understand how and why, I think that we need to look at how big tech companies control the whole digital value chain. And this is relevant for many respects, but it's relevant even also not only for, let's say, other organizations like other companies or for universities, it's also relevant for states themselves, because digital technologies are crucial for everything that states do, from specific services like healthcare or education to the everyday operations of the state. Everything uses digital technologies. So the fact that the digital technologies value chain, in particular AI, but not only, are controlled beyond ownership by a few companies, that these companies come only from two countries in the world, the US and China, has effects at the level of the possibilities of governments around the whole world to do an relatively autonomous exercise of their power. And I say relatively autonomous because, of course, it's not that I'm claiming that before big tech, let's say I'm Argentinian, a state like the Argentinian state, the Argentinian government could rule independently. No, of course not. There are also power relations among governments, in particular, the simplest one, just to give a sense of what I'm speaking about here, is North versus South, or core periphery, developed, underdeveloped countries. But even for the core, even for Europe, even for Canada, is relevant that states are losing autonomy in their capacity to rule vis-a-vis big tech companies and their association with the US government, in particular in what I will be discussing today. And this is happening, and this is why I've spoken of a value chain. Some people speak of a stack. The stack is kind of a pile, and it doesn't put sufficiently emphasis on the network dimension, on the systemic dimension, on the relations that are built. This is why I prefer referring to it as value chain or production network and different terms than stack. But what I'm basically saying here is that these companies are not by themselves producing all the technology that then is used for subordinating others. And I will put a lot of emphasis in my presentation here, because I think that what they are constructing is a sort of what for some people would be neocolonialism. I think that expanded dependency makes more sense. This comes a bit from my background in studying dependency theory, or the dependency school, where basically we are not only interested in seeing how the core, in this case, a core of companies and with governments, control the periphery, but also in the periphery, we identify complicit actors. So it's not simply when you're thinking in terms, and I will give you an example, when we're thinking about US big tech and their power in, let's say, Europe, is not only exercised directly by these companies, but also indirectly through companies like SAP, who has all its clouds, all its services, its software now operating as a service on the cloud of big tech companies, or Mistral, who is supposed to be a French unicorn that will give Macron and the French government more autonomy or sovereignty, but actually depends on the funding, on the investment of US big tech companies. So we need to look at these different levels and not just think of, okay, we have big tech on the one hand side and all the rest are poor subordinate organizations. And understanding these networks is part of what I've dedicated my new book to. So basically, here we will be speaking about, on the one hand side, knowledge predation or knowledge extractivism, because I will show you different ways in which knowledge is co-produced by many, but then ends up being appropriated and monetized by a few. And I will also speak of a term that I introduce in the book, which is this idea of epistemic totalitarianism. We are perhaps used to discussing things like PepsiCo or McDonald's imposing the farmers the type of potato that needs to be grown and how, and also even patenting the type of potato and neglecting or completely sidelining their traditional knowledge, their knowledge on how to farm, by imposing the technologies, imposing how are going to farm. We also have the cases of biopiracy, for instance, where we have a lot of drugs being developed by appropriating local populations' knowledge about plants. What we are seeing here in the case of, in particular, digital technologies is a sort of expanded epistemic totalitarianism where AI, and I will discuss a lot about this throughout my presentation, AI is even being imposed as the new method of invention for everything, from drug development to brand building, whatever discipline, even social sciences and humanities, we're supposed expected to embrace AI, do more AI uptake, and think about the questions, think about our research problems through this method of invention. So definitely there is an exercise of epistemic totalitarianism at another level, and we need to always bear in mind that this represents leaving aside not only a lot of alternative methods, but also alternative questions, alternative problems that are not being addressed because the AI that we are getting is the AI that big tech companies and their allies or complicit actors, and I will go to that in a second, want. So through and just as to move into the content of the book in itself, the book starts by discussing what I've been working on for over a decade, which is this idea of leading corporations concentrating intangible assets defined as intellectual monopolies. And a first and simple definition would be to say that these are companies that are continuously monopolizing different types of intangibles and turning them into their rent-bearing assets. And this is not only science and technology, this is also the way they are using data, the way they are using narratives, the way they are using also experiential knowledge or learn other ways of producing knowledge that are not science-based. And the result is that these companies become a sort of permanent rentiers. They are still capitalists. It's not that these companies are not accumulating capital, that they are not hiring workers. They do so directly. But on top of that, they are permanent rentiers. They are permanently capturing value in the form of an intellectual rent that is the basically associated to all these intangibles that they are constantly appropriating. This, however, doesn't result in a monopoly in the sense of a market monopoly, a single company in the market. It may and it may not be the case. And this is one of the important things that I add in the book, which is a sort of expansion of the idea of concentration, of economic concentration at the market level. Economic concentration typically at the market level is used to think of a single market, one market, and then we look at the share of the market share of different companies in that market. And then we may have discussions on whether, okay, if a company has 87% of a market, can we already consider it a monopoly or not? Or does it need to have 100%? This form of concentration, when one company has a very large share of a market, is what can be described as a choke point. Once we move away from the idea of the market as a single space or an independent detached space, and we move to the idea of the market as a network. If instead of thinking of markets as individually detached spaces of exchange, and we see them within the as a network, it can be as a global value chain if you want, but also think beyond global value chains. All the markets are interconnected. So if you even keep the analogy or the idea of a global value chain to think about this, if in one segment of the value chain, there is one company with a large concentration of the market, think of NVIDIA, think of TSMC for the foundry of the semiconductors, these companies have the capacity to exercise a choke point in the network. So their market power is not constrained to the specific market. It's actually exercised at the level of the whole network. But this is one form of network power or network concentration. The other one is to have a sort of panopticon view. The panopticon view is basically a company that is positioned in a place within the value chain that enables that company to know who's doing what and how, to have control over the information system that that value chain represents or is at the same time. And this is already where we see the relevance of digital technologies and who sees and who can see what. And of course, the two can come together. And we will see that companies like Amazon, Microsoft, and Google have both, have choke points and also have panopticon views. Other companies like, let's say, Nestle, that only in the Middle East sells 900 different products. These companies have a panopticon, a panopticon of part, of course, of the world economy, but even if they don't have choke points on any particular market, they will still have a great view, oversight of what's going on at the level of the global economy or part of that economy. And just before we move on, just a caveat, because I think that perhaps for this audience it's not necessary, but intangible assets do not only mean a concentration of intellectual property rights. In fact, knowledge can also be turned into an asset by keeping it secret. The speed of the innovation is also a way in which companies turn knowledge into an asset, because the time that it takes others to understand what that knowledge is about is already too late, and they have already moved one step ahead. So this dynamic that takes place for favoring and reinforcing intellectual monopolization even leads to make, in some cases, intellectual property rights useless or unnecessary. And a way to see this and how this works more in action is by looking at the table of the top organizations in terms of granted AI patents. For instance, this comes from 2022, and you can see that the top two are not a big tech companies. Only the third one is Alphabet, which is Google. Microsoft and Amazon are way below. Meta is not even featured on the table. If there is a WIPO report, for instance, on generative AI patents, and the top company organizations are concentrating patents are neither US big tech nor OpenAI, they are Chinese companies. So clearly, I mean, of course, I'm not saying that all these actors do not matter, that all these actors are not doing at least some research and turning it into patents. But I'm saying that this is definitely not the whole picture, that this is only part of a much more complex way in which knowledge, again, is co-produced by many, then appropriated by a few, and even monetized by a smaller few. Because universities, for instance, have patents, and that doesn't lead usually to rent-bearing assets. So to make sense of this transformation, I want to give you a sort of like snippet of two types of variables that make sense to understand how leading corporations have evolved over time. And I've chosen for this to compare IBM, the old IBM, with today's big tech. So the old queen of technology, IBM, if we look at IBM in the 1970s and make a comparison between its capital expenditure, so its tangible assets investment or investment in potential tangible assets versus its R&D investment, both of them as a share over revenues, we can see that IBM was an integrated enterprise, what Chandler would have described as a newly integrated enterprise, what Monopoly Capital would have described as these giant corporations. And they were giant because they were heavy intangible assets. We moved to the 1980s, and we already see the transformation that for many was described as the emergence of global value chains, where what we have is that the leading corporations of the past is not that they stop leading, they continue leading, but instead of leading by concentrating mostly tangible assets and knowledge being embedded in the machines, being embodied also not only in the machines, but also embodied in the managers that, because the company was integrated, could capture the information from different departments and make sense of everything and plan the production process. It's not that knowledge before didn't matter. It's just that it was embodied in part of the other part, if you want, of the type of assets that companies had at that time. And this is why we tend to think historically that the leading corporation is the one that is concentrating tangible assets. And now, eventually, what matters is the concentration of intangibles. And now I have here two different companies already. So IBM today and NVIDIA also for the same decade. So 2013, 2022. And you can clearly see how the two trends have flipped. For IBM, IBM became a company that it remains very light in tangible investments, whereas its intangibles, or specifically its R&D over revenues, have went up. And NVIDIA, if you also look at the shares, in the case of NVIDIA, is quite impressive. Always between, like, let's say 20 something, 30 something percent of its revenues invested in R&D, and very low in terms of tangible capital investment. But then we have these four companies, and these four companies have a different dynamic. They are not the typical leading corporation of a global value chain that concentrates the intangibles and outsources the manufacturing. These companies, at the same time, invest a lot in R&D and invest a lot in tangible assets. And this speaks, of course, of the complementarities of the different parts of the of how AI is produced and broadly of digital technologies. The necessary processing power is explained also in these figures. It's not that Amazon, Microsoft, Google, and Meta are simply expanding their offices to hire more people. Actually, when one looks at the evolution of employment over revenues, it's possible, is evident that it's not the case, because employment over revenue goes down, which means that they are extracting more from each worker, and they're actually extracting more from society, which is also why the revenues go up so high and so fast and outpace the increase in employment. So basically, this leads me to speak in a way of two phases or two types of intellectual monopolization. One is the simple one, the one that is the first thing that comes to mind when I say concentration of intangible assets, which is if they are concentrating intangible assets, it's because they are outsourcing the rest. And this is the idea of the global value chains, how they emerge with the leading corporation concentrating the intangible part. But now the phase two includes things that are way more complicated. Because in the phase two, we have deconcentration of part of the intangibles and reconcentration of part of the tangibles. And we also have criticality at the level of materials and nature. So this leads to what I describe as spheres of control that are spaces where leading corporations can control beyond ownership, that include global value chains, that include things like the franchising model, platforms, but that also include what I describe as corporate innovation systems in papers that I've already published with Bentake Lundvall, and where basically we explained that this knowledge that then is turned into an asset by the intellectual monopoly may not necessarily be produced by the intellectual monopoly. It's actually produced at the level of systems. Part of the production of intangibles is outsourced, and in this outsourcing of intangibles, this means that there are other organizations. Of course, startups come to mind, but also universities, public research organizations that participate in this co-production of knowledge, that are receiving this outsourcing of R&D steps, modules, or segments. I will not go, I can then afterwards, if you're interested in this, I can go into the details of all the examples that are on this table. I will just say one word about the MICA concept, this idea of means of information and knowledge appropriation, that if you can see my mouse, it's over here on the table, which is part of the critical assets that will be kept in-house by the leading corporation when it decides how it will be exercising corporate planning, what will be outsourced, what will be kept in-house. And what do we mean? And I say we because this concept is something that we develop on a paper that is about to be published at Socioeconomic Review with Cedric Duran and Anna Ben-Susan. We speak of means of information and knowledge appropriation, as the name clearly explains, or we hope so, as usually tangible, but it may even be intangible means of production that are essential for the capturing of the intangibles from the environment, and also essential for turning these intangibles, for continue the production process of those intangibles. So of course we have data centers in our mind, as well as satellites, undersea cables, but we can also think of the factory itself as a means of information and knowledge appropriation for companies like TSMC. TSMC is an intellectual monopoly because the knowledge that is constantly producing and appropriating is the knowledge that emerges from the routines, the work of the engineers that are at the foundry itself. So for TSMC, outsourcing the foundry is outsourcing everything in its business, because all the knowledge also is, or the knowledge production is not detached from the shop floor. Unlike what happens with a company like NVIDIA that designs the semiconductors and therefore can exercise this split between what insourcing the intangibles and outsourcing all the rest, and be still in what can be described to some extent as this phase one. So let me emphasize again the idea of corporate innovation systems before we move on, because it will be key for all the empirics and for understanding the different power dynamics in the co-production of knowledge that I will describe in most of what's left of my presentation. So, in a nutshell, I think that we can portray this idea of corporate innovation systems by saying that knowledge is co-produced by many. Then there is a process where that knowledge is appropriated by some of those. And we need to distinguish appropriation from assetization, not only because part of what is appropriated then doesn't enable the garnering of an intellectual rent, but also because sometimes these companies, in particular big tech companies, have the capacity to capture rent on the basis of things that are formally open. And this is what they do, for instance, when they put pieces of their software in open source. So formally, that's still open. That's not, it's the contrary to something that is appropriated. And still, because they put pieces of their software in open source, they're capable of afterwards garnering a rent. So this is why distinguishing between these three concepts is key. Something that is missed usually when, for instance, the economics of innovation literature speaks of innovation. It forgets all the history that leads to the innovator, quote unquote innovator, which actually usually is the appropriator turning the knowledge into an asset. So throughout my work, I've been trying to proxy these corporate innovation systems, how to map them. And the first thing that I've done in several publications was to proxy it by looking at scientific publications. And with scientific publications, we can get part of the breadth and depth of the corporate innovation system, because companies like, let's say, Microsoft, that publishes thousands of papers per year, also in the publications, we can trace their co-authors. And here we have for Microsoft its most frequent co-authors between 2012 and 2021. And you can see here on the table a comparison between the share of co-authored publications and the share of co-owned patents. And the difference is appalling. Almost 90% of the papers were co-authored with other organizations, which means that Microsoft is not doing research by itself. However, when it comes to patenting, only 1% of the patents are co-owned with someone else. And this, of course, is a very imperfect metric, because there are many quote unquote collaborations, of course, asymmetric collaborations that do not result into papers, so that cannot be traced with these metrics. There are many things that are not patented. Think, for instance, of all the non-disclosure agreements that these companies sign with the hundreds of scholars that have double affiliations with them, that work part-time at the university and part-time at the company. But still, and even considering that we're missing a big part of the picture, this already portrays this idea of knowledge predation. And I mentioned knowledge predation, but I also coupled it with epistemic totalitarianism. And epistemic, to make it work, to have your priorities, your research agenda becoming the research agenda of the field, these companies in particular, in the case of tech, Microsoft and Alphabet, became quite active, actually the most active organizations in the most important AI conferences. So what I'm showing here comes from another paper where I looked at the top 14 AI conferences between 2012 and 2020, and I analyzed which were the organizations that were more frequently co-presenting papers in these conferences. And I found that over time, the centrality of Microsoft and Alphabet, also a centrality of Facebook or Meta, which is here, increases to the point where by the last period that I analyzed, they were the two most central nodes of the whole network. And this is not only relevant in terms of agenda setting, because they can influence not only their co-authors, but the co-authors of their co-authors, and so on and so forth, but also geopolitically, because what this network shows is that Microsoft is the bridge between these clusters, which are mostly integrated by Chinese organizations, and all these clusters, which are mostly integrated by organizations from the rest of the world, particularly from core Western countries. And just one more thing before moving on. It's not that Amazon is not influencing the network. It's a company decision that it's not presenting so many papers, and it keeps its AI developments more secret. But once we look at who is at the scientific and organizing committees of the conferences, Amazon is presented as much as the others. These companies also make a decision, therefore, or have a say in deciding which papers are accepted for the conferences, which paper will get a prize. So this is also extremely important when we think in terms of the type of AI that we have. So yes, we have thousands of organizations around the world doing frontier AI, but the network, the content of the network, the agenda, the questions, the methods end up being quite imposed, even if in a soft power way, by these companies. And the same thing happens with open source. In the case of open source, it's not simply that these companies, let's say Google, for instance, open sourcing TensorFlow or open sourcing Kubernetes, or Microsoft when it bought GitHub and it continued promoting GitHub as a space for open source, and even more recently, although it's not exactly open source as it should be, Meta open sourcing Llama. All this is not simply to keep employees happy and to get feedback in advance from the community. And also, it's not only that by doing so, their pieces of software will get a lot of free work from developers that contribute to improve it. And I've done some research in the past on how significant this is, and it's always like extremely significant. You can see here, for instance, one of Facebook's projects in open source receiving like a huge majority of the contributions from outside Meta. But the most important reasons why these companies are putting part of their solutions in open source is with comes here at the bottom, and with Mark Zuckerberg explains to his shareholders by early 2024 when he explains why they open source Llama, which is that their aim is actually to create an ecosystem. And the ecosystem is part of this corporate innovation system where innovation is co-produced by many, but then ends up disproportionately benefiting those that are at the core. What happens as a pattern of innovation when in this new phase of intellectual monopolies is that we have a stable core of companies with a turbulent periphery, among others, of startup companies that do part of the research, that are bearing most of the risks, and then do not profit at the level of the big tech, or share, or are forced to share the profits, even if they were the ones bearing the risks, not the big tech. So they also use open source to turn their solutions into de facto standards. And once they are chosen as de facto standards because they are free, then they can offer complementary products, develop an ecosystem around it, from which they will also harvest profits and appropriate part of what has been co-developed. And I already anticipated that these companies are also controlling startups. They control, in particular, AI startups, but also startups more in general. And the control of the startups operates in different ways. The most simple way to see this is by looking at corporate venture capital, because big tech companies, in particular Amazon, Microsoft, and Google, have become quite active, and they are among the most important venture capitalists in the case, specifically for the case of AI. And you can clearly see it here on the table on the top of the screen, where the third company or the third organization of venture capitalists investing in AI startups by February 2024 was Google, and the number 10th was Microsoft. So Google was even above Sequoia Capital or others that are not even featured there, like SoftBank and many more. And this is data for the number of companies they are investing money in. And it's not number of companies in general, but this is the number of companies that had each of these funders among their top 5 funders. So it's not that they were just giving what for the startup would represent pocket money. It's really having Google among its top 5 investors, or having Microsoft among your top 5 investors. The table on the top is for AI startups, and the table on the bottom is for startups in general, to also give you a sense of how expanded this dynamic is. If one looks at the amount being invested, these companies are even more important. Amazon, Microsoft, and Google poured into the generative AI startup world 2/3 of all the money that was invested in 2023. But this is because they concentrate very big investments in a few companies. And one could get lost in discussing the relationship between Microsoft and OpenAI, or Google, Amazon, and Anthropic, and so on and so forth. This is not just happening with the top AI startups developing the models. This is happening wide and large in the whole sector. And why? This is not mainly a financial investment. This investment is an investment to perpetuate and expand their intellectual monopoly. By doing it, they have a direct line with the CEO. They can influence what these companies are researching on, what they are in, what get privileged access, anticipated access at least to what they will be releasing, which is basically what happened with Microsoft and OpenAI, since Microsoft started investing in OpenAI. And they also exercise technological technological lock-in, because part of the investment, in particular, part of the investment that Amazon, Microsoft, and Google give to startups is not money wire transferred to the account of the startup. It's a cloud credit. It's a compute voucher. It's a voucher for using cloud computing services. And once it ends, the startup will have all this architecture already inside the cloud. So it becomes extremely expensive and time consuming to leave. So basically, they just stay, and they stay and stay and stay and stay. And the cloud is not only a place where startups get infrastructure as a service, it's not only the place where we store our pictures or files. The cloud is actually computing services supermarket. Every computing service, software as a service, infrastructure as a service, platforms as a service, data as a service, models as a service, everything can be rented on the cloud. And the cloud as a marketplace operates exactly like Amazon's e-commerce marketplace, with a lot of quote unquote partners or third-party companies that are offering their services and that need to share part of the revenues of what they sell with Amazon, Microsoft, or Google. Because these three companies, Amazon, Microsoft, and Google, concentrate around 65% of the cloud computing market. And these three clouds also do not interoperate easily. And every time someone moves data, let's say from one cloud to the other, needs to pay for doing it. On top of that, this computing services supermarket actually is not a, I go and I buy, let's say, my pair of glasses. And I then go to my place with my pair of glasses. I mean, I don't have the skills, but if I did, I could do reverse engineering of this. This is not possible with cloud services, because cloud services are sold as black boxes. You can use them, but you don't get access to the technology. And this is why also the locking, the technological dependency, perpetuates over time. And if this wasn't enough, I will continue with the analogy of the glasses. The glasses, I bought them, they were manufactured somewhere. Then I bought them at a store, let's say outside here, my place. And now I'm consuming them in my place. In the cloud, digital services are produced, exchanged, and consumed. Everything happens on the cloud. The cloud is not simply a marketplace. The marketplace is only part of it, because it's there where digital services are produced. It's there where the models are coded, trained, and run. So every time we are consuming, every time we're asking a question to ChatGPT, it will be consuming processing power that is on Microsoft Azure, for instance. And this not only engenders dependencies at the level of the startups, but globally. And globally also for other leading corporations. And this is where the fieldwork makes even more sense. Because why was I so interested in looking at other leading corporations? Well, I was interested in looking at what they were doing, because if other leading corporations become technologically dependent, technologically subordinated to Amazon, Microsoft, and Google, imagine the rest of the world, imagine governments, in particular from the peripheral countries, and so on and so forth. And here you have some snippets where different people that I interviewed from companies clearly state that they don't like the fact that they depend on cloud giants. And someone from Amazon, someone from AWS, a senior software engineer, telling me that his job was precisely to create a stickiness, to make it harder for other companies or clients in general to leave the cloud. So basically, we can speak, if I was speaking before of the idea of knowledge predation, if I continue with the biological analogies, we can now speak of cannibalism. And why? Because these are the companies that are at the top of the hierarchy. Is extraction among those at the top. So what they describe as strategic partnerships, and even Google, for instance, has a team of people dedicated specifically and based in different parts of the world, dedicated specifically to work during years to get these strategic partnerships, to get, for instance, LVMH on board, to get Renault on board, to get huge leading corporations signing these long-term agreements that are not only for using their clouds, but also include co-developing technology, also include using other services. In the case of Google, for instance, Android for the cars of Renault was part of the agreement. And why? The question that is relevant then is why? Why, if you are Renault, Toyota, Nestle, IKEA, you name it, Walmart, Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, why, if you are yourself an intellectual monopoly? It can be one based on brand building and capturing intangibles systematically on the basis of brands. It can be a big pharma company that captures science and technology results that are then treatments or different approved drugs. Why? Why, if you yourself are an intellectual monopoly, would you accept to be cannibalized by these cloud hegemons? And basically, I found three reasons that then I encapsulate in only one. These three reasons is one, I already anticipated that AI is a method of invention, is being more and more imposed by big tech themselves as the main method of invention. So if you are an intellectual monopoly and you need to keep on turning more knowledge into your intangible assets, you want to get this promising method of invention that will help you to have more drugs being developed, that will help you also, if you are a big pharma company, to better identify where to do your clinical trials, which are the physicians that are then prescribing your drugs more frequently so that you go and visit them in particular with the new drugs. And all these are uses that are already in place of AI that I'm mentioning. If you are Coca-Cola, you will also want to do brand building with AI. Even Coca-Cola, for instance, had at one moment in time a campaign where consumers could design their own generative AI poster by giving some instructions to a Gen AI, and it was, of course, a Coca-Cola poster, for instance. So part of the marketing even is being replaced by AI. This is one of the method of the reasons, but the other reason is control. And if you want, AI as a method of invention is also about control. It's about controlling the consumers. It's about controlling how knowledge is produced. But then it's also about controlling the sphere of control that I was mentioning before. It's about controlling your global value chains. It's about controlling your franchisees like IKEA or McDonald's do. And to do that, you need information systems. To do that, you need ICT technologies. And today, these are digital technologies. In particular, AI is being used even for corporate planning. For instance, big tech companies offer specific services. Microsoft has one that is called demand sensing that puts together a bunch of data sources. So not only the past, the information of past or previous sales, but also information about the macroeconomy of the country, information about the weather. With all this data together, they then forecast what the company is expected to sell in the future. Even using AI, for instance, for planning and weather forecasts together with value chain forecasts for knowing how many Kit Kats they need to shape to one place or the other, or if they need to shape the Kit Kats in more or less refrigerated. So there are so many uses of digital technologies that go from something very tiny, very simple to the whole corporate planning structure of the company. So basically, what big tech companies are doing, and I will try to go faster and wrap up in the next perhaps 5 minutes or less if you want, Kin. What these companies are doing is offering as a service, of course, not really opening up the technology, but offering as a rented service their own capacity to rule by metrics, their own capacity to rule by processing and analyzing data. And if we think of the history of measuring and how it's associated to ruling, and in particular to states ruling, and how all this has been transformed, and we face companies like Google that say that their mission is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible, blah, 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 blah. what these companies actually telling us is we are the only ones that have the capacity to concentrate all the data of the world, and we are the ones that will decide how you will get access to the data, how, and therefore they are creating reality for us. And this way of ruling and controlling and defining not only what is measured, but also what we know and how we know it, and that it can directly be applied to every production process, can be applied to the control of how other organizations are producing inside global value chains and the other architectures that I was giving you as examples. And this is basically what they are doing. A Microsoft operations manager was telling me about how they sell the services, that with these services you can see your business, and it functions more efficiently with AI. And another one from Amazon was emphasizing a lot this idea of the whole point of supply chain management, which basically is the business way of saying planning, corporate planning of your global value chain, is about forecasting. So if it's about forecasting, just do it with AI, basically. So what we get there for is that if we start with this idea of an intellectual monopoly that has a sphere of control that is not only the company, but also all these production and distribution networks, platforms, value chains, and so on, and the corporate innovation system, and this works for Coca-Cola, AstraZeneca, and Walmart and Google in the same way, what then I identified was that Amazon, Microsoft, and Google are different. And they are different because they control the global value chain that is essential for all the other companies, all the other intellectual monopolies to continue ruling those that are within their spheres of control. So actually, in a way, we can think of ruling or the corporate power or the capacity of corporations to exercise power on our economic power, more precisely on others, as a hierarchy. And at the top of the hierarchy, we have cloud hegemons. We have Amazon, Microsoft, and Google that even subordinate other tech companies like Netflix that fully runs on the cloud and uses a huge diversity of AWS services to operate, for instance. So this is why I play with this idea of cybernetics and the hierarchies or multi-level control that takes place when we think of the different orders or second order of cybernetics. And it is in this context, and just to wrap up, that we need to think of the states and what happened with political power when states become a cloud subject themselves, with locking contracts and how they lose autonomy to govern. Here you have examples both from the US and the UK. I think these examples are relevant in particular because if the US and if also the UK are being locked in by the technologies of these companies, and the Jedi, it was a project that in the end didn't happen. The US Department of Defense was going to give all its information systems, like migrate everything to one cloud, a dedicated cloud, not the same cloud that then we go and store our pictures, of course, but provided by only one company. Then they realized that this was so dangerous and would lead them into such a dependency that it was better to take another approach. And they ended up offering contracts to different companies, but still, in the end of the day, it's just a handful of corporations that can do it. The UK government has just signed a 5-year agreement with Microsoft. And there have been many attempts. There has been this attempt to build digital public infrastructure, which is a misleading name because actually what is called digital public infrastructure is not the physical infrastructure, but 3 platforms: the digital ID, e-payments, and data exchange. And big companies themselves want governments to be providing these digital public infrastructures because basically they need to operate somewhere, and that somewhere is their own clouds. And also they expand the data subjects of the world because those that were not on the internet before, if your ID now is digital, you will be digitalized by your own state. So I think that basically, if and this is definitely the last slide. If we want to go beyond the myth of technology as progress, which is something that is being portrayed more and more prominently, not only in peripheral countries, but also here in the UK, everything is about competitiveness, everything is about economic growth. in the European Union in particular, everybody has the Draghi report like stuck on their faces and keeps on thinking that the problem in Europe is competitiveness. So they keep on thinking that companies are not sufficiently productive. They need to be more productive, and they push how to do it with more AI, which leads to more technological dependency, and which forgets that it's not that places in the world like Canada, like Latin America, like Europe, it's not that the productivity indicators that we see are falsely created, because they are created for a world where all the value that is produced inside a country stays in the country. If you think about what productivity measures, measures GDP over the employed people, and it assumes, therefore, that it's all the people in one country that are creating that value. But if what you have is a few companies from the US capturing value from all around the world, with all these intermediate actors, the other intellectual monopolies that also capture value for their own different places, which normally sometimes is the US, but sometimes it's also the tax heaven as well, the data on competitiveness and productivity results in things that are completely misleading, because we are not taking into account these value captures. So when the policies claim that there needs to be more AI uptake because of this impressive productivity increase that they will generate, and it still hasn't been seen anywhere, by the way, what they're leaving aside is that technology, in particular ICT technologies, information technologies, and now digital technologies, have been historically developed also for control. And control not only of the at the level of the military, but control of workers. And we have all this tradition that goes from Braverman to today's Pasquinelli book on the Eye of the Master, analyzing the role of ICT and digital technologies for control, the separation of conception from execution, and how this has a disciplining effect on workers. We also have from a global south perspective, as I was anticipating before, the role of the dependency school, explaining underdevelopment by means of the capacity of the core to monopolize technologies. And I place here my work on intellectual monopolies and the work of others on intellectual monopolies, because basically what we are bringing to the picture is, one, that there is an global corporate control beyond ownership. So all the dynamics that I've been showing you today, from the global value chain to the corporate innovation system, portray a capacity or or companies that have the capacity to control how value is produced, how knowledge is produced, even if they don't own the assets, even if they don't hire the workers that will be doing those either products or creating knowledge and so on and so forth. And they do it at a global scale. So these also transform the dynamics and generate more inequalities internally for the countries, even for those that host intellectual monopolies. And this is why knowledge predation is so important for understanding today's capitalism, as well as understanding that these companies, when they are controlling these corporate innovation systems, they are planning innovation. They are defining the R&D, the prioritized R&D lines, not only of its own R&D laboratories, but of wider, way larger and wider spaces. And this results in the fact that what we know and what we don't know, the type of science and technology that we get and the one that we don't get, is their call. And ultimately, because AI is a method of invention, and it's been as I was saying throughout my presentation, it's been showcased as the best method of invention for almost everything. They're even shaping, or they have a capacity to shape more and more how we think and how creative work is conducted itself. Which is why I think that more than ever, we need to reclaim digital sovereignty, but not for a specific government, regardless of which government that is, but as a roadmap to really build a digital stack for people and the planet. So something that needs to be international, needs to be democratic, needs to be ecological, and more than ever needs to be put the development of science and technology at the service, not only of people's needs, but also people's desires and wants, because it's in part because these companies also bring to a lot of people pleasure and joy that they are where they are, and it's their way also to control beyond ownership. Okay, this is it. Thank you.